big as you. Thanks very much for, I know you've got good things to do with an evening in London, so thanks for coming here, and I'll try and make it worth your while. The Plundered Planet is I think, the most important of the books that I've written, and I want to try and persuade you of that. So, what's it about? It's an attempt to build common ground between environmentalism and economics. Now, it's easy to build common ground, you just talk warm mush, and everybody agrees with you, so that's no use. So I'm trying to build robust common ground, and that means we're going to wave bye-bye to the fringes of each group. Right? So I just accept that. Right? That there'll be two groups who absolutely hate the Plundered Planet. One is the fundamentalist wing of the environmental movement, who I think of as the romantic environmentalists, sometimes aristocratic, they would say. And the other is the sort of absolutist wing of economics. And the absolutist wing of economics basically thinks that there's nothing special about nature. The fundamentalist wing of the environmentalist movement thinks that nature's so special we should never touch it. And I'm trying to build that common ground in the middle. It's called the Plundered Planet because what's special about nature, from an economics perspective, what's special about it is that natural assets don't have any natural owners. The normal way in which an asset acquires owners is somebody creates the asset, somebody makes the asset. And in making the asset, the ownership's defined. Natural assets are not like that, they're just there. Same with natural liabilities, which I might come to. And so, natural assets and their management depends upon acts of governance. Now there are two great holes in the governance of nature, if we look across the world, and I'm going to sketch those two holes and look at each of them. One hole in the governance of nature is in the poorest societies on earth, what I call the countries of the bottom billion. And they are typically, not invariably, but typically they have rather weak governance. Natural assets are the most valuable things in their societies, and so rather weak governance meets high-value nature, and that weak governance is stressed beyond endurance. And what you get is plunder. Plunder's a big emotive word, and I'm a petty little economist, so let me bring that big emotive word down to earth and say what I mean by it. Right? Plunder of nature takes two forms. One is where the few expropriate what should belong to and benefit the many. Anybody who's worked on Africa has seen that form of plunder again and again. And the other form of plunder, which is really at the heart of the concerns of environmentalists, is the plunder by the present of what should benefit the future. And both of these forms of plunder are rife and both matter. And good governance of nature means protecting nature from those two forms of plunder. So there's one hole, the poorest nations on earth. I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me sketch the other hole. The other hole is those natural assets and liabilities that don't have the good sense to recognize our man-made frontiers. And they're transnational. The fish of the oceans don't swim around with little passports, right? The carbon of the skies. There are a lot of the natural resources beneath the oceans, the natural resources beneath the Arctic and the Antarctic. These are basically, at the moment, unassigned natural assets and liabilities. So far it hasn't mattered because technology's not been good enough to get at them, and now increasingly technology is. So there's going to be a scramble to get governance ahead of technology. And at the moment, technology is winning the race. So, those are the two holes that I'm going to be discussing tonight. Let me start with the poorest nations on earth, the countries of the bottom billion. And I want to convince you that the mismanagement of natural assets in those countries is going to be the biggest issue by far of the next decade in anything to do with development. And to convince you of that, I'm going to give you the one number from the plundered planet which in a year's time you'll still remember. So there's the challenge. And we'll start not with the poorest countries, but with the richest countries. We'll start with the OECD. And the OECD collectively covers about a quarter of the Earth's land surface. We're going to take that quarter of the Earth's land surface, we're going to take the typical square mile of that quarter, and we're going to look underneath it. When we look underneath the typical square mile of the OECD, there are about $300,000 worth of subsoil assets. And now we're going to move to Africa. And we're going to do the same concept. The typical square mile of Africa. We're going to look underneath it. And to make it more fun, at least for me, you're going to tell me. $300,000 in the OECD, what is it in Africa? To make it manageable, I'm going to give you a choice. It could be less, and it could be more, and you're going to vote on it. So here we go. Who thinks that in Africa it's less than in the OECD? And who thinks that in Africa is more than the OECD? And this is why you've got to remember it, because you're all wrong. Nearly all of you, right? Because the lady at the back, obviously the guy at the front who probably read the book. First, let me tell you, not only, although you're wrong, you're in good company. A couple of weeks ago, I did this in London to the annual meeting of ARC, the Absolute Return on Capital Group, which was the chief executives of all the biggest pension funds and investment funds in the world. So there were 250 of them. There was more than $1 trillion in the room. And so you'd think, you'd hope. These are the guys who are going to manage the pensions that you won't be getting. So you hope if anybody on earth knew, all 250 of them got it wrong. And then the next evening, I was speaking in Paris at the triennial meeting of the International Development Group, the World Bank's fundraising effort. So the representatives of all the donor agencies in the world. They all, every single one of them got it wrong. Right? So you're in good company, but not only are you wrong, you're very wrong. Because the actual number for Africa is only $60,000. 300,000 for the OECD, 60,000. Right. Now, what's going on? These are two huge chunks of the Earth's surface, about a quarter of the Earth's land territory each. Why so different? I mean, statistically, the chances of, you take two pretty random quarters of the Earth's surface, the chances of there being less underneath are a fifth under one as much as the other. Very unlikely, because what we're looking at is the fundamentals of geology. This is millions and millions of years ago, before the Earth got around to doing hot, cold, wet and dry, it did the geology underneath. That's what we're looking at. So it must be purposive. And I can think of only two purposive explanations for this huge difference. Why has Africa so much less? One is that God just hates Africa. And everything we know, we can't reject that explanation. But the other is that there's actually just, I cheated here. Because the figures I gave you were for known subsoil assets. I tried to find the figures for unknown subsoil assets, and I just couldn't find them. So, obviously what's going on is there's just been a lot less search in Africa and the other countries of the world. Now, why does that matter? These are the last frontiers on Earth for discovered natural assets. With high global commodity prices, and they're high despite the worst world recession we've had for 80 years, this stuff's going to be discovered. Right? By hook or by crook, over the next decade, it'll be discovered. Probably by crook. And so this is going to be a tidal wave of value extracted out of Africa and the other countries of the world. And potentially, it's a tidal wave of money coming into them, which can transform them with their own money, not our money, their money, can transform them from poverty to prosperity and sustained prosperity. Okay? So there's a huge upside opportunity. But of course, if we look at history, not only will this be the biggest opportunity these countries ever had, it'll be the biggest missed opportunity. Because what we look at in the history of resource extraction in these countries is basically the plunder of one form or the other. So the fundamental challenge for the poorest countries over the next decade is to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. History doesn't have to repeat itself. Look at what we've all been reading about the last month in Britain rather gleefully about the Germans and the Greeks, right? And why is it that Germany is so obsessed not to have any inflation, even in the depths of a world recession? Because Germany lived through hyperinflation, and they learned not to want it again. So societies can learn. In all the societies that are resource-rich, or that will be resource-rich, as discoveries take place, there are brave people who understand that in the past their resources have been plundered, and they're determined to make the future different. Our job is the modest one of trying to help them. It's their struggle, not ours, but we can at least do a bit better than we've done in the past. So, first thing is, what have they got to do? What have they got to get right in order to avoid plunder of type 1 and plunder of type 2? And it's not easy. There is a whole chain of decisions that has to be got right in order to harness natural assets for sustained development. It's because it's not easy that it usually goes wrong. It's because it's a long chain. I haven't got time to go through the chain. I'll just sketch. There's a chapter for each link, but I'll just tell you what that says. Step 1, chain. First link in the chain is discover your natural assets. Well, you know that's gone wrong. Right? That's why there's so few being discovered. Second link in the chain is how do you capture value for society? That is, how do you have an effective tax system so that the few don't plunder from the many? And what's going on at the moment, that link is very often just catastrophically broken. Democratic Republic of the Congo, which incidentally is neither democratic nor a republic. It's only recently been renamed Congo. Anyway, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eastern Congo, believed to be exporting about $1 billion a year of gold. Revenues into the DRC treasury from taxation of gold exports, $37,000. So, this is plunder big time, and it's of a scale that really, really matters. DRC, one of the poorest societies on earth, with this huge opportunity. I just flew back 3 days ago from Zambia, which is not DRC at all, but exports of copper, about $2.5 to $3 billion a year. Revenues flowing into the treasury of Zambia from copper exports, 100 million. So about 3 billion going out, about 100 million coming in. So this story can be told again and again across Africa at the moment. That link in the chain is broken. It's fixable. And this design of effective taxation, which is not a matter of sort of expropriating companies. It's a matter of having tax systems that look like Chile or something like that. Or Canada. The third link in the chain is to avoid the region in which you're extracting the resources from blowing up. Don't do a Niger Delta. I've not got time to talk about that, but it's obviously a rather important link. Link after that is, suppose you've got all the money coming in and you've solved the Niger Delta problem, what do you do with the money? And in particular, the key decision is between consumption and investment and savings. I just met the new Nigerian finance minister about 3 weeks ago. There's a Nigerian who was the managing director of Goldman Sachs in London, just become finance minister of Nigeria. So, of course, I congratulated him on having moved to a superior ethical environment. But his first question to me was, are we saving enough out of the oil revenue? And unfortunately, the figures at the moment show that Nigeria's oil revenue just meets Nigeria government recurrent expenditure. So actually, sort of savings, investment out of the oil revenues at the moment, kind of zero. These revenues are unsustainable. You're running down a natural asset. But ethical responsibility to the future is to accumulate other assets and hand them on to the future. This is incidentally a point where I part company with the fundamentalist wing of the environmentalist movement. They seem to think our responsibility to the future is to preserve a set of natural artifacts. So we're sort of curators of natural artifacts, and we have to hand these natural artifacts on to the future. Now, sometimes being curators is the right thing to do, but if you're a poor society, and if Nigeria can actually harness its oil, they'd be crazy to preserve the oil. They should be taking the oil out, or cutting the forests down, or whatever, and harnessing that for future prosperity. The ethical benchmark that you've always got to ask yourself is, there's a thought experiment. Thought experiments aren't a moral philosophy, what scientific experiments are in science. So the thought experiment here is to say, imagine I was a future generation. Would the current use of natural assets be acceptable to me? Or do I regard that as infringing my rights? And that's the ethical responsibility. We have an ethical responsibility to the future because we don't own natural assets in the same way as we own the assets we've created ourselves. The assets are only there because previous generations left them to us. We've got a responsibility to hand value on. We're not curators of natural artifacts, we're custodians of nature's value. Sometimes that means passing other assets on rather than natural assets themselves. I haven't got the time, but in the book I discuss how close that is to the Christian concept of stewardship. If you look at the parable of the talents in Luke, you'll find that setting out of the concept of stewardship is basically identical to what I'm suggesting as the ethical responsibility. Final link in the decision chain is, if you're going to save and invest these assets, what do you save and invest them in? And the answer there is, don't look to Norway as the example of what to do. And for the moment, I work with the Norwegian government, and 50 developing country governments have asked them for advice. And so the key advice is don't copy us, basically, because what the Norwegians do is very sensible for Norway. Norway has more invested capital per worker than any other society in the world, literally. So if they piled up more investment within Norway, the return on it will be lower than if they invested elsewhere, which is what they do. They acquire foreign financial assets, claims on other people's capital. But of course, for Sierra Leone, which just discovered oil, for them to acquire financial claims on capital in New York would be obscene. Right? Any investment in the I'm sure Linda's been to Freetown many times, and it hits you in the face. There's not been any investment for 40 years. I'm sorry, Baroness children. I should have called them Baroness children. Anyway, so that's the decision chain, and it's broken. And not only does it have to hold, it has to hold again and again for at least a generation. That's the sort of time scale it takes to lift a society out of poverty to reasonable prosperity. So how are the societies of the bottom billion, the resource-rich countries, going to get this decision chain to hold again and again for a generation? I'm going to park that question for a moment, and I'll just turn briefly to that other holding element, which is these transnational assets and liabilities. And everybody's a bit sick of, everybody's sort of carboned out, so I'm not going to talk about carbon. There's a chapter in the book on carbon. But I thought I'd talk about something you might know a little bit less about, which is fish. Having said that, I'm probably speaking to an audience of fish experts, but that's the luck of the draw. Fish it only takes 5 minutes to get up to speed on fish. Once you're up to speed, then it's a really very sad story. So it runs like this. First of all, of course, we'll talk about the fish of the oceans. There's no defined ownership rights over them. And so until recently it didn't matter because the technology for catching fish wasn't good enough to catch so many of them that they couldn't renew themselves. And now we've made superb advances in fishing technology. Right? I mean, it's no longer, don't think fishing lines, think floating hoovers. It's got, and the fish are gone. So if we unleash that wonderful fishing technology without any restrictions, there'll be no fish. Right? It's as simple as that. They'll be plundered. Plunder of type 2. The present will steal from the future. Also plunder of type 1, because we'll get them, but people catch them. Right? So any sane person can see that as fishing technology gets better and better and better, you have to impose some global restrictions on catching fish, otherwise our grandchildren won't be eaten. Right? I gave this talk in Chicago about 2 weeks ago, and one guy in the audience put his hand up and said, what's so bad about that? You know, why bother about the future can't eat fish? Too bad, you know. That is a view, but it tends to be a minority view. We have an ethical responsibility to the future, and in this case, it's not compensate the future with other assets. Don't say to the future, sorry, there's no fish left, but here, have some more video games. They'll want fish. So, we've got to regulate, got to restrict the fish. As we do that, we create what's called rents on fish. That is, the value of fish goes up because there aren't that many of them being caught. Quick way to understand rents is to think of a barrel of oil. It costs about $7 to get the average barrel of oil out of the ground. It's worth 70. The $7 pays for everything. The capital, the risk, the labor. The other 63 is just rents. It's just the intrinsic value of owning the oil. So the rents on fish. The fishing industry is about an $80 billion a year industry. I reckon if you restricted the fish catch, the rents would be about $20 billion. I got an email last week from a team who know more about fish than I do, and they say, oh, it's more likely to be 50 billion. So I've underestimated it. It's a conservative number. Who should get the rents at 20 billion? Well, frankly, us. I mean, everybody. Nobody owns fish any more than anybody else. At the moment, fishermen think they should get the rents. Their ethical argument is, well, we used to catch these things without restriction, so we should have the rent. So It's a false ethical argument. It's based on a misunderstanding of the economics of rents. Notice in climate change, the Chinese try and make the same move. Because you could push carbon in the air 50 years ago, we can push carbon in the air without restriction in the future. And there's a world of difference between carbon when it doesn't create a problem and carbon when it does. So the ethical position has to be rooted in an economic understanding of rents, of scarcity. So in a sensible world, fishermen would basically buy the rights to catch these restricted catch of fish, and they pay us about $20 billion to do it. Instead, guess what? We pay them. We pay them, on average, about $30 billion a year in fishing subsidies. So they should be writing another big check, we're writing them an even bigger check. What do they do with that 30 billion? Guess what? They catch fish. So we're subsidizing the plunder of the world's fish stock. It gets one stage worse, because does this produce super rich fishermen? No. They dissipate the rents in competition. It's called rent-seeking economics. And that shows up as a massively inflated fishing fleet. The global fishing fleet is more than double the size that's needed to catch the fish. So these boats sit around idle. So that's the fish story. Yeah? And what you should be now thinking is, goodness, surely we can do better than that with fish. Yeah? The global governance of fish should be possible to do better. And what's alarming is that if we can't get fish right, what's our hope of getting the more valuable and more complicated natural assets and liabilities? So, how do we get fish right? Well, the answer to that question is the same as the answer to how do the countries of the bottom billion get this long decision chain right again and again. And the answer is that there's no substitute for the critical mass of well-informed citizens in each society. That doesn't have to mean everyone. In the typical resource-rich, low-income country, it might mean 10,000 people who have to get up to speed in the issues. In our own societies, we don't need to know about the resource management chain, though it would have been nice if Gordon Brown had known about it. But he might not have plundered so much of the oil. We lived through an oil boom with a fiscal deficit, which was kind of how not to do it. Never mind. The critical mass of informed opinion in our own societies is for things like fish. Where are the societies that actually end up eating the fish? We will eat the world out of fish. So it's actually the rich societies that need to understand that second pole in governance of nature. And the poorest societies that need to understand the resource decision chain. How to build that critical mass of informed opinion? Well, first of all, that's why I wrote The Planet of the Planet. My effort to try and build that critical mass of informed opinion. But here, and I'll close, technology is on our side. Because let me tell you a heartening story from a society that is actually much more repressive on information than pretty well any of the low-income, resource-rich societies, and certainly more than our own, and that is China. You'll remember a couple of years ago, there were earthquakes in China, which, and schools collapsed and killed school children. The reason the schools collapsed was that they were very badly built, because building regulations had been ignored. There was a lot of local level bribery and corruption. Within 48 hours of that earthquake, ordinary Chinese citizens had managed to do three things. First, they'd used the internet to discover why the schools had fallen down. Second, they'd discovered who within their local government had taken the bribes that meant the building regulations were not enforced. And three, still within 48 hours, they managed to organize amongst themselves street protests against those officials. There's a wonderful picture on the internet showing a Chinese local government official on his knees in the street begging forgiveness from a crowd of angry parents. I put it to you that if that sort of thing could happen in China 2 years ago, information technology is now there to build this critical mass of informed opinion in most societies. There's this famous statistic, there are 6 degrees of separation between any two people on Earth. For the first time, we have a technology which can rip through those 6 degrees of separation. So, that's why I wrote The Planet Planet. I was very heartened that I gave an advance copy to Andrew Mitchell. I was very heartened that not only did he read it, but he phoned me up to say, as I was reading it, David Cameron saw me reading it and said, I've read his other books, can you get me an advance copy? So the real reason why you should read this is that the Prime Minister's ready. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Brilliant stuff, so much to think about. Well, also very good to know, of course, that when we've got such a huge structural deficit, we have an extremely tight Prime Minister as well. We now have a little bit of time, I think, for questions and answers. It probably would be helpful if you say who you are and where you're from as well. I'll let Paul take the Q&A.
Suresh Perry from RICS Results Management Commission. Thanks. You made the link between weak governance and blunder, and the fact that weak governance has been such an ongoing problem. It's not an easy one to solve over a short period of time. Given that that is taken, you still mention the fundamentalist environment movement as being wrong to try and just be a curator or a steward of the natural resources. Is there an answer to that? In the sense, if there is weak governance, why allow the plunder? Why not be the steward or curator?
You're absolutely right. One little idea I floated in my previous book, The Bottom Billion, was that we needed a natural resource charter which set out this decision share. And enough people read The Bottom Billion that people said, well, this is doable, let's do it. So it's there. There's a natural resource charter on the web. It's still being built, but it's there, it's live. Naturalresourcecharter.org, you can all go on it. Implicitly what we're trying to do is build a convention, an international convention from below. We realise there's no chance on earth now of getting a sensible international convention top down. It's not going to happen, you know. But it can be built bottom up. This is the board of Natural Resource Charter is chaired by Ernesto Zedillo, former president of Mexico, who said, "I've seen oil ruin my own society. I don't want to ruin anybody else's." Our technical group is chaired by Mike Spence, the Nobel laureate in economics, Canadian laureate. So we've got the sort of natural authority, and why I describe it is that once you've got an international convention in place, and it might take several years, but in effect, that defines the conditions under which resource extraction would not lead to plunder. So if you haven't got those conditions in place, conniving in resource extraction makes you complicit in plunder. So that's the ultimate place where we're going. I don't put that in my talks because I don't want to scare the horses. But yeah. And so that is, it's not preserving nature for nature's sake. It's preserving nature so that we preserve value for the future, for the future's sake. Baroness Street.
May I ask you, Professor Collier, if we're being informed? Thank you. May I ask you, is there any attempt that you've made yet, or wish to make, to the mining industry, who are concerned about resources, are particularly concerned with what certain African governments are trying to do to the mining of resources? We've just been discussing earlier today about Guinea-Conakry and what's going on there. Is there a way in which we can get the mining industry to really listen, because I think that is one of the clues to getting responsible stewardship.
Oh yes, I mean, we do a lot of work with the mining industry. We have both the oil companies and the mining companies. We've been working a lot with the International Council on Mining Metals, and they're very concerned, responsible, insightful people. So I absolutely don't want to in any way suggest that they're otherwise. And they know a lot that we don't, and of course, they've lived through the chaos that plunder produces, so they don't want that. About 3 months ago, I addressed about 20 Chinese officials, senior government officials, who were, most of them were sort of risk managers in Chinese investment companies and such like. And they came to the OECD, and the OECD brought in to talk. What struck me was, first of all, these people were, as I sketched, they didn't know. But once they got up to speed on the issues, they're very concerned, because of course the Chinese have a very strong preference for water, and instinctively think very long term. And so the message that actually, as in Guinea, they were really involved in plunder that would lead to disorder within not very long, that did cause them to be really concerned. So I believe it's also possible to get China into a tent, not necessarily into our existing tent. I think the strategy of giving China the rule book and saying, this is it, we'll even translate it into Chinese, just follow it, that's not going to work. Right? So we have to build, let me give you one example of how I think China can be approached more sensibly than it is. The standard Chinese deal in Africa is infrastructure in return for resource extraction. And frankly, that is not a foolish package. If I was a responsible finance minister in Africa, I'd be quite tempted. I'd listen to the IMF saying, no, we do it all separately. You sell the resource extraction rights, you get the money, you put it into the budget, and then you buy infrastructure with it. And that way you can get better value, and you can choose what you want and all that stuff. And I think, yes, that sounds just right. And then I think of myself in the cabinet meeting with this $1 billion having come in to the budget, and me saying we ought to spend this prudently on infrastructure, and the Minister of Defence looking meaningfully at the President and saying, I think we ought to raise wages for the soldiers, sir, Mr. President, and etc. In other words, it's not such a bad idea to me. But what's damaging at the moment is the Chinese are the only ones doing it. If you're a monopolist, of course it's a rip-off. Right? I was unofficially told that the probable Chinese figures for the DRC last week, by some people who ought to know, 6 billion of money in return for $60 billion of resource extraction rights. So the right thing to do is to say, where governments want to do these things, run an auction in infrastructure. You put up, and the World Bank, DFID, whatever, could be running these things. Why not?
I'm Steve Moore of the Global Sustainability Challenge. I'm just interested if we could comment on aid versus investment. The desire really to get far more investment into the developed world, particularly sustainability-focused investment. And is there scope for new models to blend sources of capital, World Bank money, World Bank guarantees, etc., with Western institutional assets, as well as localized money? And to do that, the requirement for new models to essentially provide dispersed mechanisms of getting that investment deployed more effectively on the ground. If you could maybe comment.
Yeah, very much so. It's always struck me as bizarre that Africa and the other countries like they're kind of high-risk environments. And so the sort of financial instruments that you should be providing are risk-bearing instruments, equity, right? And yet aid is provided as basically fixed interest loans so that it's all flushed into the default risk rather than into the sort of structured finance, basically. And so that you either have these heavily subsidized fixed interest loans or zero subsidy equity. And it seems to me that it's sensible for public money to try and be harnessed to lever private money in more. So I think there's a lot of scope there. And having said that, the rate of return on private investment in Africa is pretty high. There's a lot of sort of unrealized opportunities there. I did some work with one of my bright young students, and we triangulated 3 different sources of data: return on American FDI, return on quoted equity, and return on capital in manufacturing. And all 3 showed that Africa was the highest return region. That was before the crisis. Now that we've had the crisis, basically the rate of return on a lot elsewhere in the world has gone down. Yes, just another
Neil Cruxon of the Bologna Foundation. Countries with hot sunny deserts around the world are sitting on vast solar energy resources. My calculations were probably in the millions per square mile, and the resource is widespread. So could widespread renewable resources really cause a plunder and ruin like oil?
It's always a two-edged sword. They could be a source of real enrichment for everyone, couldn't they? And it's not just solar, hydropower. Inga, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has got vast untapped hydro potential. Absolutely staggering. And the problem, there's been a lot of problems there, but one is that there's far more energy than the DRC itself could use. And so you need to have power lines going through to South Africa, which is desperately short of energy. And the governance problems of a power line going through a lot of different countries have never been addressed. In the Planet, I'll give another example of that, which is the iron ore discovery in Liberia, where in Guinea, which the natural thing to do would have been the railway line into Liberia, the cannon. It was already a railway line, but the Guinean government determined that whatever it didn't want to be dependent on Liberia, and so they insisted on a new port and a much longer railway line being built. And that was, I think, 2/3 of the whole cost of a $6 billion project was because of this failure of cooperation between 2 neighbours. So it was around, yeah.
Hello, hi, I'm Daniel Clark. I work for the International Policy Network. If it takes an earthquake in China to make politicians realise the problems with the schools, and given that the global fish stock problem is a more gradual problem, how do we make the European Union, who I believe is the main giver out of these fish subsidies you talk about, how do we make them realise, also given that they're probably less accountable to the Chinese government, that this problem exists and we should do something about it?
I was just in Brussels this morning. I didn't do the fish riff, but the Commissioner's just invited me back in early July, so I'll hit him with fish. Look, I think the answer here is that it doesn't take long to get up to speed in things like fish, and once ordinary people hear about the issue, 99% of them are very clear on it. That they say, well, let's do what it takes to make sure that fish stick around. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? And what's happened at the moment is, it's not just Brussels that's at fault, it's the politicians from each country who go to the negotiations in Brussels. And what do they want? They want a big fish quota for their nation's fishermen. And they come back strutting this big quota, saying, look how well I fought my corner in Brussels. Right? And why we need a critical mass of informed opinion in each of the societies is that when a politician next comes back and does that, he said, that's not what we wanted. So, and actually, of course, often the politicians themselves don't want to do that. They're just terrified of ill-informed voters. We've got exactly the same problem with agriculture. Let me spend a couple of minutes on agriculture. My God, the ban on genetically modified crops is just, it's kind of just gut anti-science, combined with a bit of, romantic 18th century love of holistic peasants who doff their caps, and then captured by the raw meat of agricultural protectionism. And as a result, Europe shot itself in the foot. Our grain productivity has been rising less rapidly than America since we did that ban, whereas previously it was rising so much. The real killer, literally, is that because Europe imposed that ban, Africa got it. Africa's still enthralled to Europe. And Europe shot itself in the foot, Africa shot itself in the heart. So our stupidity has very serious repercussions. So,
Ian Moore filed diplomacy in the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum. I was going to ask a different question, but I wanted to follow up on that one, because it strikes me that you've talked very much, understandably, about natural assets, to which people haven't put money in. Now, it strikes me that one of the problems with GM crops is because of differing attitudes towards intellectual property rights. And I'd be grateful if you'd say something about that, and also, if you'd like, about land ownership, if you're talking about.
I'll skip on land ownership because it's a big topic, but I will take the intellectual property rights spot. You're quite right. There are concerns about monopoly, Monsanto owning right. If that's the concern, what is the intelligent response? And the intelligent response is that Europe should be investing public money in GMO research. Europe has a very fine record of public funding of scientific research. And so the right response to concerns about American private monopoly in intellectual property is to do research across Europe publicly, create the public information about GMOs, and then give it to the world. And instead, we ban the stuff. It's so foolish. It's gut anti-science, and so we lost 14 years, and we're still not seeing sense.
I
Alexander Walken, one. You talked about the fact that in Europe, despite having quite strong democracies, we're still in hold to interest groups, whether it's fisheries or agriculture. And you're also talking about how to sort of support greater accountability for natural resources in some of the weakest governed countries in the world. So how do those networks, those social networks in these developed countries get strengthened, and what it could be our role in supporting that?
Yeah, okay, so let's accept that truth is just another special interest. But let's try and make truth win. Right? There are powerful interests shaping decisions, not all well-intentioned. In the resource-rich, low-income societies, I think, to be honest, it's not as frightfully difficult as it might appear, because what a critical mass of opinion often needs to do is not be fiercely oppositional to government. Quite often, I believe it's that senior civil servants, ministers, swim in the waters of that's sort of top 10,000, and as long as they're swimming in waters that are up to speed on these issues, they'll quite often come to the right conclusions. I do a lot of work in Africa where, like Baroness Children, I talk with sort of senior politicians, senior civil servants. And they're not all crooks. They're not all crooks. They face some terrible problems, and they're very distracted, and so they often don't get the key decision chain that really, really, really matters. But it's not always a matter of, as it were, the politics of protest. Often it will just be the politics of common understanding.
You, you mentioned in the examples you've given of the kind of resources you're talking about, like gold, oil, fish, things where global markets work not reasonably well, where it's possible to control access, in theory at least. How about resources like water, where those things don't necessarily operate in the same way, and you don't have good price mechanisms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't tackle. I've learned that if you want books to be read, they need to be short, and to make them short, you need to do basically analytic vignettes that illustrate the problem. So I take one renewable, one depletable, I take agriculture. So I don't try and produce a comprehensive kind of encyclopedia. But you can ask, if you're from DFID, Andrew Mitchell's invited me to give this talk tomorrow in DFID, so you can ask it again. I was actually trying to do the lady behind me, yeah.
Alice Chappell from Forum for the Future. Just thinking about forests, clearly a lot of people worldwide depend on forests for their livelihoods. There's an opportunity to capture more value from the carbon market, but clearly that could take control of the asset away from those communities. I'm interested in your perspective on how that might be resolved.
Yeah, although it's a short book, it does have a chapter that's basically about forests. It actually starts with the Brazilian rainforest. And it starts with my son Daniel's first political act. He learned about the Brazilian rainforest in school. And Daniel, aged 8, comes storming home in tears. No, not sad tears, they're angry tears. And those angry tears are directed at me. Not as his father, but as a representative of the generation that is going to plunder the Brazilian rainforest before he's old enough to stop us. Yeah? And so I build the chapter on puzzling out why is it that Daniel feels so, he feels his rights on the rainforest being infringed. He's somehow got property rights over the rainforest. We've never seen, he's not Brazilian, and yet he doesn't feel that about our neighbour's car. So part of the chapter is just trying to understand the distinctive ethics of nature. Nature is special, and it's important to recognise that. Now, a rainforest is actually very complicated ethically because there are different layers. The layer I've talked about tonight is kind of the simplest, that there's a natural asset which in a sense should belong to all the citizens. If that was the end of the story, the forest should belong to all the citizens. If you can harness that asset in such a way that it reduces poverty now and in the future, you should do it. Sometimes that's the right answer, right? Sometimes the right answer is chop the damn forest down, right? We're standing on what used to be a forest, and thank goodness somebody at some stage chopped the forest down and built London, right? And we don't think our rights were infringed by the people who chopped it down. So sometimes the right thing is to chop it down. The case of the Brazilian rainforest is complicated with a second complication, which is that if you do that, you emit a load of carbon, and that's a global liability. Right? So even if it made sense for Brazilians, there's a liability that they're not compensating the rest of the world for. Incidentally, that's an interesting way of phrasing it, isn't it? The liability that they're not compensating the rest of the world for. Very unclear whether we should pay the Brazilians to preserve the rainforest, or whether we should say, no, if you're going to chop it down, you've got to compensate us. Right? We're too inclined to get into a culture of we'll compensate you. There's a lot of baggage in that ethical assignment, much of it not justified. But then there's a third complication of the rainforest, which is that people live in it, and they live in it, and they know no other world. And if you destroy their world, you can't compensate for it. I suppose Martians flew by and saw Earth and think, wow, this is just what we need. Pity, what we need is right in the middle of the Earth, but we've got to protect everybody's rights. You're all going to be relocated on Pluto, and we're going to give you 17,000 whittlewatts each. You'll be just fantastic. And the answer is, no, we'd rather have Earth, right? And presumably that's what the Brazilian people living in the rainforest would say. And that, to my mind, overrides everything else. We just don't have the rights to destroy their world against their wishes. I'm not for preserving them in aspect. I think gradually they'll probably want to, over the next century or so, integrate into Brazilian life, but it should be at their pace, not at ours.
Ian Weir, Politics, Ian Weir, Politics International. I'm glad to hear that you'll be speaking to DIFA tomorrow, but for our purposes, could you tell us what top 3 practical policy recommendations you would give to this government on dealing with natural resources in Africa?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, one is help this energize, finance this process of lowering the cost of information, lowering the cost of truth in the resource-rich societies. Basically, we need to ignite an information flow, and it's possible. I mean, there are huge information flows. Usually, they're either for bad or for trivial, and we just need one that's actually useful. Do that if you can help with that. The second thing is that we could make sure that that we do not connive in the plunder of these natural assets, and that our companies do. And I would point to our resource extraction companies, our construction companies, and our banks as three major groups of economic activity which in the past have connived in corruption in the resource extraction sector. The money flow out of the resource extraction companies bribe their way in. The construction companies then go on the expenditure side and bribe their way into contracts. And the corrupt money then flows into our banks. And what the corrupt money does is then finance the patronage systems of the political crooks. We've got a terrible record in Britain of actually enforcing anti-bribery legislation. Terrible. And it's been on the books 10 years. There's been only one prosecution in Britain. I happen to know about that prosecution because the Serious Fraud Office brought me in as the expert witness. And it's all out in the newspapers. There's nothing to hide. But the only reason that actually was prosecuted was that the management of the company changed. And the new management looked at the books and said, oh my God, the previous management's just been blatantly bribing its way into contracts. If we let this sit here, we're liable. And so they came to the Serious Fraud Office and said, please, prosecutors, we will plead guilty. That's the only case in Britain in 10 years that has been prosecuted. Now, as expert witness, I was asked to testify on the cost of this corruption. And what the Serious Fraud Office expected me to say was, well, the cost is, this was a little bridge building company, everything, the bridges cost 15% more, so it cost this country $7 million. That's not what I said. Who got that $7 million? I was originally a middle-ranking official in the Ministry of Public Works. And with that sort of money, he could have gone off and led a high life. But he didn't, unfortunately. He invested the money. And he invested it in political power, patronage. So he left his job in the Ministry of Public Works and managed to become a Member of Parliament. And some societies, having money helps to become a Member of Parliament. And then he rose, and by the time of this case came to court, he was his country's Minister of Transport. So, what's the cost of corruption there? This little bridge building company doing the 15%. It's that this country had a crook as its Minister of Transport instead of an honest guy. The crook beat an honest guy because he got this money to finance the patronage system. So that's the cost of corruption. You get a corrupt political class because it can finance the patronage system. It's financing them to a considerable extent of corruption within our companies. Right? So we've got to be part of an international effort to clean that up, to clean our banks up. If the deposits in the banks are connected with terrorism, wow, the banks go illicit. If it's just rich crooks plundering poor people, well, maybe. So ethical standards. We don't expect people to be saints, we just expect decent ethical standards. I've been trying to get the G20 in Canada to take this up. Canada's doubly appropriate. It's the most resource-rich country in the OECD, and Toronto is the headquarters of financing for all the small resource extraction companies. And they're not. And so, so it's a mixture of information, lowering the cost of truth, and then cleaning up our own act and making sure that we do everything we can that the international community cleans up.
Good evening, thank you. My name is Hugh Elliott and I work for Anglo American. So those who don't know us, we're a large diversified mining company, so I thought it would be good to business, I would say. We're freshly back, so I'd be glad to hear from conducting business integrity training from one of our officers in the developing world, not least driven by the fact that there is a new bribery act which was passed, as you know, just recently in the UK, which is likely to come into force later in the year, and I think that business would have no disagreement at all in saying that's probably high time too, even though maybe the minority bit would like to be a bit clearer about what exactly is expected of us. But my question was a different one. It was around your point about economic rents, and it was to try to understand, you gave the example of oil costs 7, rent at 63 out of 70. How do you determine a priori, given that 7 you only really know at the end of a project, what all the costs have been? How do you determine what that is in advance in the way you construct the fiscal structure of the spend?
Yeah, I just realised that exactly this time last week I was having dinner with the Oppenheimers. So I think Anglo doesn't have stuff to be ashamed about. De Beers doesn't have stuff to be ashamed about. So De Beers did actually a tremendous job of changing its approach over the last decade, and that needs to be acknowledged. What's a sensible rate of taxation or of capture of rents? It's part of this sort of, you can compare internationally. The terrible dilemma that a lot of low-income countries have got into is that they can't make credible commitments. Because they can't make credible commitments, companies are very naturally very wary of paying serious money. And so what tends to happen, that's why there's been so little resource discovery. Because companies basically don't trust the terms on which they sign up. But then it's a vicious circle, because if you don't trust the terms, you bid lower. And so the terms are then sort of even less attractive. And especially for prospecting, you get into a terrible nightmare where before you search, the expected rate of return might be normal, and then after you've searched, either you've not found anything, you've lost your money, or you found something, and you've got something hugely more valuable than you paid for. Economists call that the time consistency problem, because then the government comes along and reneges on the deal. Knowing that, companies don't come in the first place. So one policy option, which is not for Britain but is for the international community, is to strengthen the capacity of low-income resource-rich governments to make credible commitments should they want to do so. And one natural venue for that is the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization is all about law and enforcement of international transactions. But it's not being used at all for the poorest countries, the problems of resource extraction. I was just invited to the World Trade Organization last October, and I gave this idea there, and then they asked us to write it up. So myself and Tony Venables, used to be chief economist of DFID, just published a thing through the WTO, proposing this extension of the WTO's role, which would be more useful for the poorest countries. So that's sort of thinking out of the box, but it's not outrageous. I guess we've obviously. Last question.
Kia ora. I'm Millicent Ward from Action Aid, and thank you very much. Fascinating presentation, whetted my appetite for the book. One of the things that Action Aid has a position on is ecological debt, and I wondered, how do we know, in terms of your kind of formation of plunder, how do we know that we are where we are in terms of the spectrum of plundering of the present for the future, and when can Daniel make that decision about what point we reach where the plunder has already happened?
Yeah, I think our hopes for this natural resource charter is that it will gradually build, first of all, it will set out this whole decision chain, and secondly, that other people will come into this process and start to score each decision in each country year by year, so that it will become clear which societies there's plunder and which societies there isn't. And that, given modern information, that's entirely feasible. So we're trying to build a process which other people can join, very much the sort of thing that NGOs could join in and score these different components of the decision chain. So that's the process we have in mind. I think the world of sort of top-down rules and regulation is over. But that doesn't mean we're going to be rulers. It means we've got to build the rules from the bottom. And I thought I heard you say you were going to buy the book. That was very happy.
I think that might be my key. So thank you, Professor Collier. Fascinating talk. So much to think about there, to think about reforming our institutions, our ideas about development, and about how we marry together our diverse interests. Only really remains for us to thank you in a conventional way. Thank you both.